Welcome to Inside the Guard. I am your host, TP Grant, and today we're talking about UFC Fight Night 63, Mendes versus Lamas. So let's start off by saying I'm going to be upfront with you guys. There wasn't a ton to talk about in this card in terms of kind of what I want this show to be about, which is, we talk big picture events and fight cards. We talk guys kind of growing as like a fighter, kind of like some meta game of MMA and like specific techniques. And we're going to get into this card a little bit, but all in all, this card was kind of a placeholder, it really felt like, in terms of the way it was held. I mean, it very much felt like a card that FS1 wanted to fill some time before college basketball got started. So the entire feel of the card kind of reflected this. Now, we have some interesting things to talk about kind of moving forward, but in general, this just wasn't the most impactful card. I did kind of like the middle of the day feel for it. I feel like I always kind of feel that the UFC, obviously, they're the biggest pack of UFC fans, generally speaking, tends to be on the West Coast. It's where the sport got started. It is where a ton of fighters train, is out in the Western time zones. So it makes sense that a lot of the timing of UFC events is geared more towards Western time zones than the East. It was nice for once not to have to stay up till 1 a.m. to watch a fight card, to have an evening afterwards. I mean, heck, I'm actually recording this the day of to free up my Easter Sunday, which is really quite nice to be able to do. So that part of the card I actually very much enjoyed. And we got some pretty good fights out of it, starting, of course, with Chad Mendes and Ricardo Lamas. I think this fight, Lamas actually was pushing the action a bit more in this fight than I feel like he regularly does. Lamas kind of has a tendency to kind of wait around for his opponent to make a mistake. And I think he knew coming into this that kind of waiting on Chad Mendes to make a mistake was a great way to just get beaten to a pulp. So he came out and he really worked to establish his kicking range, Lamas being a very good kicker. And he really tried to go to work on Mendes' front leg with those leg kicks. Which, historically speaking, has been a weakness of Team Alpha Male. But I think we're all pretty familiar with the fact that Team Alpha Male has gotten to the point where they've really filled in their striking deficit quite nicely, largely due to their striking coach, Dwayne Ludwig, or former striking coach, and now Martin Kampman is running things there. And Chad Mendes really responded well to that. He was constantly pressuring Lamas, constantly forcing Lamas to back up. And then eventually they got into kind of a 50-50 exchange where they both threw right hands at the same time. Mendes moved his head offline beautifully, and Lamas did not, and he got absolutely cracked. And then the finishing sequence was pretty excellent from Chad Mendes, constantly creating space, keeping Lamas off him, making room to strike. So overall, really good showing. I mean, not much you can take away from this fight other than the fact that Ricardo Lamas is a good fighter. He's a really good featherweight. Chad Mendes is amazing. I mean, he's on that level of like top tier featherweights. He's up there with Aldo. I mean, obviously, everyone talks about how amazing Jose Aldo is. Chad Mendes is right there with him. Obviously, Aldo's got his number. Aldo has him beat. 2 fights now. Mendes has lost both times. Mendes has lost convincingly both times. But, I mean, he's on that level. He is a phenomenal featherweight. And I'm tuning in anytime Chad Mendes is fighting. It seems like a very, very long time ago that, Chad Mendes was this incredibly boring fighter that no one wanted to watch in the WEC, who was like trying to cartwheel past guys' guards in ways to, like, in an effort to try to find a way to be exciting. His transformation as a fighter has just been phenomenal and is a really good case study in what really good coaching can do for a fighter. Not saying that Team Alpha Male had bad coaching beforehand. Quite the contrary. They're one of the most successful camps in the history of the sport, and there are good reasons for that. But bringing in a top-notch striking coach to go with what they were already doing, I mean, just made a huge difference in their game. So really, really fantastic. And that's pretty much it. So we're going to move on down the card. Iaquinta, they call him Raging Al for a reason, people. So let's talk about this decision. Obviously, Jorge Masvidal clearly won round one. I mean, it was painfully obvious. He beat the snot out of Iaquinta, and surprisingly so. I think a lot of people expected it to be a bit more of a contest on the feet, and Masvidal came out and had none of it and really set everything up really nicely with his kicks, and then transitioned to his boxing, opened a nasty cut on Iaquinta, and just beat the heck out of him for that first round. And then the next 2 rounds were really quite close, and there's a pretty easy case you can make that Iaquinta edged out both of them. There's a really good case to say that Jorge Masvidal won the first round clearly and edged out the second round. I personally feel like the third round was pretty clearly Iaquinta's round. So I'm not behind a 30-27 scorecard for Masvidal. I have no problems with a 29-28 scorecard for Masvidal. I mean, it's one of those fights that could have gone either way. But when you watch that fight just as a fight, if you're not scoring along with it, it's one of those fights where, yes, Iaquinta, it was a close fight on the cards, but it wasn't a close fight in the schoolyard. Masvidal clearly beat the snot out of Iaquinta. So obviously when the cards got read and Iaquinta ended up winning that decision, people were a little upset. And Iaquinta goes off on the crowd in a way that had a lot of fighters on Twitter giving him some support, because here's the thing. I understand the frustration of fans in a situation like that. It's not the fighter's fault that the judges made what is, in, the eyes of the people, an incorrect decision. Their job is to go in there and fight and try to win. It doesn't always work out great. It doesn't always look good. It's not always a good fight. But it's their job to get in there and fight. It's the judge's job to make the decision correctly. So I can I totally understand Iaquinta's getting upset, and I think a lot of fighters were quite pleased for a guy like Iaquinta kind of giving it back to the fans. Not that MMA fighters don't like the fans. They love the fans, but if you ever kind of, you talk to fighters on Twitter or kind of talk to them there's some frustration with the way MMA fans kind of treat fighters after fights and after losses and things like that. Just generally, it can get ugly at times, and so I think a lot of fighters were kind of tickled to see a guy just like giving it back and throwing it right back in the fans' faces. For me, the big takeaway of this fight is the idea that I've been saying this for a while. If you read my old Sunday perspective pieces, it's something that I've brought up before. I really feel the 10-point must system, I think, works fine for MMA in theory, but the way it's being used currently is not the optimal way to use it. We are given there's a way to vary your score built into the system. Obviously, you guys all know, if you win a round, you get 10-9. 10 points for the winner, 9 points for the loser. You add up the points, and whoever has the most points wins. The problem is that no one uses the 10-8 rounds, the 10-7 rounds, or the 10-10 rounds. Or they are used, but they're not used nearly frequently enough. And as a result, all rounds are valued the same. So that first round by Masvidal is valued in terms of like how much he won by, the same as the third round that I feel Iaquinta kind of barely won. That really needs to be addressed. There are degrees by which people win rounds, and Jorge Masvidal won the first round by a greater degree than any other round in that fight was won by, and the score should reflect that. So I don't know, the answer might be giving that a 10-8. If you don't feel that was a real 10-8 round, then the second round most likely should have been a 10-10 round. And then yet again, you've given this idea that now there's a differential in scoring. That actually would have led to a draw in this case, or no, I'm not sure. It would have depended on how other people scored the fights and things like that. But I'm a big believer in the idea that you need to have some differential. Now, the counter argument to be made is that MMA fights are so short, only 3 rounds, that a 10-8 is so devastating and so hard to come back from. Well, first of all, if you can turn around and have a dominant round yourself and receive a 10-8 for it, then it's not, if it becomes more common, then it's not as devastating. Right now, a 10-8 round is devastating because you have to damn near kill the guy to get a 10-8 round. If they become more common, it'll be easier to respond with the 10-8. But I hear that argument, which is why the half-point system kind of intrigues me, where if you just kind of barely squeak out a round, you get only a half-point advantage. So Jorge Masvidal wins the next round, the first round 10-9. The second round goes to like 10-10, and then the last round, Iaquinta gets a 10-9.5 win. And then Jorge Masvidal wins the fight. So it's something that needs to be kind of worked through, because I feel like there's just not enough differentiation between rounds in terms of like who's won a round, because there's a big difference sometimes between 10-9 rounds. It can be, this fight's a case study in it. That first round and that third round and that second round were all scored the exact same in terms of value on the fight. And that should be addressed. And I think that's something that needs to happen moving forward. I don't think it will happen, but it's the way to make the 10-point must system more applicable to MMA, because in boxing, if you get knocked down, if you get a knockdown, you're automatically awarded a 10-8 round. If you knock the guy down, you're automatically awarded a 10-7 round. Dominance is automatically rewarded in boxing. But in MMA, we don't really have that marker, because sometimes a knockdown's not a knockdown. Sometimes it's a guy trying to lull a guy to the ground. Sometimes, a guy's actually really hurt and his opponent doesn't pick up on it. Or sometimes the choke looks, how do you deal with submissions? If, every time Joe Rogan thinks a choke is deep, the guy's actually escaping it. It's really hard to determine watching sometimes if chokes are close or not, because you got to be in the choke to know how close it is. So there are some problems with the 10-8 system, and I think, obviously, judge training and judges being more aware of when to award different scores could be helpful, but, who knows? At this point, with MMA judges, it might just make the whole thing entirely worse. But this fight, I feel like the result the people are upset about, really more the result of the scoring system and how the scoring system is being used, more than anything Iaquinta did. Maybe you can give Masvidal a little bit of blame for going into coast mode a little too soon in that fight, but I really kind of point to the way the scoring system is being used. All right, so let's talk a little bit of we're going to move down. We're going to talk Michael Chiesa and Mitch Clark, and we're going to get in a bit. We'll also talk a little bit about the Julia Pena fight, because a little bit of like MMA metagame talk here. In terms of takedowns from the clinch, Michael Chiesa used trips super effectively against Mitch Clark. And Miljana Dudeva also, despite being completely physically outmatched in this fight, in her fight with Juliana Pena, hit some really nice throws and trips. And it's one of those things that it is something that we're seeing more and more of in MMA. We're seeing more trips, more foot sweeps from the clinch and things like that. But it continues to be a really big edge, especially in like kind of the middle ranks of weight divisions, for fighters who have like a really good feel for them, because for the most part, they haven't been like a widely integrated part of the MMA game yet. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. Number one, the takedown base for most MMA fighters is wrestling. And don't get me wrong, they trip all the time in wrestling. If there's a way to get someone down to the ground in no-gi, they're doing it in wrestling, because it's a hyper-competitive sport that's practiced all over the world. If something works, somebody somewhere is doing it. But the upright clinch that we see in MMA is just something that you don't see much in freestyle or folk style wrestling. Guys tend to be bent over a lot, which is why you see a lot more ankle picks and things like that in wrestling. And you don't really see them in MMA, because you're never really kind of in that bent over posture. And it's why we see that this tends to be the thing that most judoka and sambas tend to be most successful with when they come to MMA, because MMA fighters are just not used to defending those sorts of takedowns. And wrestlers also not super used to having to defend those types of takedowns, because they just don't come up that often in wrestling matches. Whereas like in judo and sambo, like your first level of takedowns are usually some sort of foot sweep or trip, because they can be done at fairly long range. So it's really one of the first things you have to learn how to defend. Like I can't, but good judoka that I have trained with can foot sweep people with one grip at range. They can trip you with one grip at range, because they have just such an excellent way of moving you about with their jacket grips. Now, obviously, there are no jackets in MMA, so you have to get into the clinch, and At that point, but at that point, it's the same game, like moving the person's weight onto one foot or the other, and then if they move that weight onto their foot, blocking that foot and forcing them in that direction, causing the trip, or if it's a foot sweep, you take the weight off the foot, and then you sweep the foot out of the way, and then you take them back that direction, and they don't have that foot there to catch their fall. So it's one of those things that we're seeing it more and more in MMA, and we're going to see it increase, especially as we get, I think specifically with the influx of Russian fighters who have trained judo and trained in sambo and are more accustomed to this sort of thing. But I mean, we've seen like wrestlers get taken down by, like, Shogun Rua made use of an outside trip for his entire career and was getting guys down with it. They're very effective, and it's just something that hasn't quite worked its way in yet, because a lot of the MMA fighters who aren't wrestlers by trade, who didn't come up wrestling, they only have time to pick up so much of the game, and they pick up the stuff that's most commonly used in MMA. Now, obviously, like the really high-level wrestlers, like you're not going to be able to just like foot sweep Cain Velasquez over, because the man wrestled basically his entire life until going into MMA, and then he trained with Daniel Cormier, who's an Olympic-level wrestler, and he trained under Dave Camarillo, who was an Olympic-level judoka. The man knows how to defend a trip. But when you hit like kind of that mid-level of MMA, there are guys who leave themselves kind of very, very open to that. And it's nice to see kind of more clinch diversity coming in. I should also mention guys who do a lot of like kind of Thai-style Muay Thai. Yes, that Muay Thai is kind of a global thing. And in Thailand, trips, sweeps, and what are known as dumps in the clinch are really common ways of scoring. And you'll see Matt Brown do this a whole lot. A lot of people kind of attribute this to Matt Brown having done some judo. I don't believe Matt Brown has actually ever done judo. I think all of his sweeps and trips and takedowns come purely from training Muay Thai clinch work. So it is something that I think we're going to see more and more of. And it's something that I'm always happy to see, because I think fighters having more tools to create more offense is always a good thing. I think one of the other things we saw, speaking of Russian fighters, is in two fights we saw kind of the biggest hurdle for Russian fighters, and Shamil Abdurmahimov kind of presented a really nice case study in this, as did Dudeva, in that. So the Russian scene, the amount of combat sports in Russia is insane. I mean, Shamil was a Sanshao fighter in Russia. For those of you that don't know, Sanshao is a competitive form of kung fu that is basically kickboxing, but with takedowns. Quite a bit of wrestling goes on in there. And then Dudidov was a belt wrestler, did some time in belt wrestling, which belt wrestling is a very old form of wrestling where the wrestlers wear a belt and you're allowed to grab it. And there's some step wrestling styles that include some belt wrestling, and it was integrated into sambo and all this stuff. So there's just tons and tons of rule sets in Russia. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. And one of the things is none of those rule sets really encourage a lot of ground fighting. Don't get me wrong, there are some really good Russian ground grapplers. Fedor was absolutely phenomenal in his prime on the ground, but they're not the norm for Russian fighters. There are a lot of good wrestlers, but there aren't a lot of good guys who are particularly good off their backs. And Russian MMA, there's quite a lot of really sloppy bottom play, and to be perfectly honest, some sloppy top play going on in the Russian scene, and guys kind of get away with their really awful bottom games because there aren't a ton of elite kind of grapplers who make them pay on the Russian scene. There are lots of great takedown artists, some really good strikers, and yes, there are some really good submission guys on the Russian scene, but it's not as common as in, like, say, Brazil, where like everybody can grapple on the ground pretty much. So we kind of saw that with Shamil getting mounted and having absolutely no idea how to escape. It looked like 1990s MMA when the mount was a death sentence, and the referee basically had to stop the fight because of positional dominance, that Shamil had no idea how to escape and was just getting clowned on. And then Dudaev trying to punch while she was mounted, which is if any of you have ever been mounted, it is essentially a useless exercise. There are a few instances of guys actually striking effectively from the bottom of mount. It is very much the exception to the rule. And so we see this idea that for Russian fighters, a lot of times one of the first things you check when they hit international level MMA, when they start fighting guys kind of off that regional scene, be it an M1, which is something of an international promotion. I mean, it is definitely a step up from like your ACB or what is it? Some of the other fight circuits out there. Or obviously if they make it to like the Western Europe scene at like Bama or things like that, how do they grapple on the ground? Can they hang with the better grapplers there? And that's kind of one of your big litmus tests for Russian fighters. We're going to be seeing a lot of them, so it bears having kind of this watching point to understand, like, you know, seeing it, like, how does a guy respond when he's on the ground? For Shamil and Dudayev, it wasn't very good. It was not a very, inspiring performance there. And Dudayev actually has a halfway decent submission game from her back. She has some tricks from her guard, but once her guard gets past, she's not really all that capable of, you know, escaping, especially against a physical, powerful grappler like Juliana Pena, who's just an absolute beast. I think we're going to skip over talking about the Clay Guida fight, because Clay Guida is doing what Clay Guida does. I think the last fight we're going to touch on today, we're going to cut a little bit short, is Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier doing obviously a phenomenal job in this fight, making his moving up from featherweight to lightweight to take on Carlos Diego Ferreira. And Ferreira's not a joke. I mean, Ferreira's not going to be a title contender anytime soon, likely ever, but he's a really tough kind of entry-level test in that division. He absolutely ran over two... what am I thinking of? Ultimate Fighter veterans in Colton Smith and Ramsey Nejim. Just blew through them. He went the distance with Beneil Dariush, who I think we can all agree at this point is really, really good at fighting. And Dustin Poirier made him look like an absolute amateur on the feet. Poirier established his range. Poirier's a very long, lanky dude. And Ferreira was constantly trying to reach for Poirier. And as you're trying to, if you're trying to catch a guy who is longer than you in striking, honestly, the best thing you can do is try to take an extra step. You know, you need to somehow work an extra step and close in, sneak some distance on the guy, steal a little bit of the distance between you. What you don't want to do is overcommit your balance and lean, because number one, it takes some of the power off your shots, and number two, that is when you get hit the absolute hardest. And I'm speaking from my very limited striking experience here, where when I caught myself reaching for strikes is when I got absolutely cracked with counters. And that's exactly what happened to Ferreira in this fight. Poirier established his range with his boxing, which is quite good. He's a good offensive striker. And Ferreira started reaching for him and trying to close that distance. And when Poirier was able to kind of stay off the cage and keep the distance between them maintained, Ferreira was just getting crushed. And eventually it caught up with him. Poirier knocked him down. And then on the ground, Poirier did a really old school guard pass, like a Valley Tudo style guard pass, where he stands up. Because number one, passing the guard standing, it's pretty much the way to go. One of the first things, when you first start out doing jiu-jitsu and you learn guard passing, you learn how to pass on your knees. And then once you start facing guys with good guards, you learn that you really don't want to be on your knees in someone's guard. And you saw this earlier when Ferreira went down. He started working some chains on Poirier. He started attacking that triangle, attacking that omoplata. And the first thing Poirier did once he got kind of Ferreira's legs off of him and he could posture was stand up. When you stand up, you have so much more base, you have so much more ability to move, you're much more mobile, and all of the Ferreira's submissions, all of his triangles, his arm bars, and his omoplatas are really far away and extremely difficult to do. And when you do straight jiu-jitsu, you then work into a position where you can control the guy's hips and work for a pass and all that. But in MMA, as you pass, you can just crack the guy in the face. And one of the strategies that was developed not a long time ago, but in the Valley Tudo, Pride days of MMA, early 2000s, when guys really started kind of looking at MMA as its own sport and trying to find ways to integrate striking and grappling together. One of the first camps that really did this was Shutebox, who was kind of like, they were the cutting edge MMA gym of their time, because when they hit the ground, they were looking for the best, most efficient way to do damage to an opponent. And one of the tricks they came up for passing guard was that as you shift your hips through a guard pass, you can throw a strike, and you can throw a strike very effectively. So one of their favorite things to do was stand up, and when the opponent puts his legs up to kind of keep you at bay, resting his feet on your thighs or your hips, you control those and you throw them to the side. And as you do that, you turn your hips and kind of point your shoulder at the guy. And then as you come back around to pass their guard and you turn your hips and you turn your shoulders, you come in with a punch. And that's exactly what Dustin Poirier did. And the resulting punch has a lot of power as you're twisting and turning and driving the way you would in a good punch against a standing opponent. And the results of it are pretty devastating. And Ferreira ate one of those shots full on, and he was just immediately out. So it was a really great all-round performance from Dustin Poirier, announcing his presence in the lightweight division. I don't know how far Poirier can go in the lightweight division. It's an absolute shark tank. Ferreira's a tough guy, and he's kind of entry level almost to the division. So I'm really excited to see what Poirier can do as they kind of move him along into better and better competition. And that does it for this week's Inside the Guard. Next week there will be no show as the Krakow fight card has nothing worth talking about on it. I pretty much made it as this show started that we do televised content only. Fight Pass cards, just there's not enough to dig into to really do a show. And unfortunately, while the UFC on Fox 15 card looks outstanding, I will be traveling for my real job that weekend, and I won't even be able to watch it live, much less do a show. So unfortunately, there will be no Inside the Guard, and I'm real for that card, and I'm really upset about that because I'm really looking forward to it. I probably won't be watching it until Tuesday or Wednesday afterwards. So that absolutely sucks. I'm really excited for that card. We will be back for the UFC 186 Johnson versus Horiguchi card, and then hopefully we'll be rolling along after that because I don't think I'm going to have any more interruptions from my usual day from my day job. So thank you for listening. Have a fantastic week. I'll see you a little bit later in April. Enjoy the fight cards, particularly that UFC on Fox card. It looks absolutely awesome. Welcome to Inside the Guard. I am your host, TP Grant, and today we're talking about UFC Fight Night 63, Mendes versus Lamas. So let's start off by saying I'm going to be upfront with you guys. There wasn't a ton to talk about in this card in terms of kind of what I want this show to be about, which is, we talk big picture events and fight cards. We talk guys kind of growing as like a fighter, kind of like some meta game of MMA and like specific techniques. And we're going to get into this card a little bit, but all in all, this card